Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you for coming. My name is Monique Shira, and I'm pleased to welcome Richard Thaler to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Richard is the Charles R. Walgreen Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Behavioral Science at the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business, where he is the director of the Center for Decision Research. Richard co-directs the Behavioral Economics Project at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He is considered a pioneer in the fields of behavioral economics and finance, and he has authored numerous articles and 3 books. Trent Griffin will be moderating today and is a member of the OSG finance team at Microsoft. He blogs at 25IQ and is the author of 6 books, including the upcoming The Complete Charlie Munger. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Welcome to this talk. This is a particularly wonderful talk for me because Richard is one of my heroes, an intellectual hero in particular, because I studied economics in college, and although it was interesting and the math was interesting and the theory was interesting, it mapped very little to what I knew about the real world. It just seemed odd, but it was fun discipline. I learned to think and it was enjoyable. But then, and I don't exactly know how or why or when, this whole sort of discipline of applying psychological and behavioral comments to economics sort of entered my mindset. And at that point, I was investing it and involved in business, and it just appealed to me because it mapped to the real world. It was like, whoa, here's something that actually really, things like prospect theory and many of the biases, they were consistent with what I actually believed. And then as I started to put the two together, I realized that for me, behavioral economics explains why what I learned in college was only sort of right, like first order, something like that. So anyway, and then the other thing I appreciate is skill as a writer. We were just talking about it, but as I try to write myself, but he tells stories and he tells funny stories. And this book is everything that I aspire to as a writer. He's funny, he's humble, and those two aspects of a book appeal to me tremendously. Now what I've done, I've gone very old school, and I have some note cards here. For the younger people, they don't know what a note card is, but I have note cards. And the reason I have note cards is because I've always kind of wanted to be like James Lipton on Actors Studio, right? So at the end of the interview, I'm going to ask him what his favorite cuss words are, and I'm not going to do that. All right. But we're going to talk in the beginning about the title of the book. So why that title?
So that's a good question, and I must say that the hardest part of writing a book, and all of it's hard, 2 of the hardest parts were the cover and the title. And the cover, I'll tell you an interesting story. So, you can see, some of you have seen the cover. Publishers have a rule, which is that authors must not speak to cover designers. There are at least 4 intermediaries between the author and the cover designer. And I was going through this with 2 publishers because it's simultaneously published in the UK and the US, and you need a separate publisher in the UK to add the U's. And so some of the covers they came up with were abominations. And I asked them, well, I have a great editor who I love and has helped write the book, and I'm allowed to talk to him, and then he's allowed to talk to the sales team, and they're allowed to talk to the art department, who talks to the cover designer. And so the first version of this cover, the look of it I like, but there's a flock of birds, and in the current version, you'll see there's just one missing. But in the version they had, that bird was just flying in the opposite direction. And I said, no, that's not it. It's not just doing the opposite of everybody else. And for months, I was trying to get them to think of something else to do with that bird. But it was all like telephone tag, you know. So finally, they were so desperate. And having written a book before, I had put in the contract, I have veto power over the title and the cover. So I finally got them to put that bird down there. And I'll explain what I think that bird is doing when I answer your question. So the title, we were going all around with variations on it. But it sort of works at three levels. The first is, as Trent already alluded to, and I'm sure as most of you know from some undergraduate economics course at some point in your distant past, economists study some weird creatures. I call them econs, that are really smart, you know, like as smart as Nathan Myhrvold, perfect self-control, not like Nathan. Nathan is a friend of mine who's interviewing me tonight, but don't pass any nasty things on to him between now and tonight, because who knows what he's going to ask me about. And so perfect self-control, no emotions, and they're basically jerks. If they found your wallet lying on the street, they would take the money. And only if it were like super convenient would they go out of their way to return it to you. So, you know, most of the people I know aren't like that. And so misbehaving refers to the fact that most people misbehave by economic standards. I call them humans in the book to distinguish them from econs. So it's a book about misbehaving in the sense that people aren't behaving the way economists think they should. The other sense of what the title refers to is, I've spent my career pointing this out, which was an act of professional misbehaving. You know, I was the kid pointing at the naked emperor, and much of the book talks about the 40-year struggle to convince people that this was a topic worth thinking about. And possibly the third level in which the title works is, and Trent also alluded to this, this book is not written as a proper book. So it is kind of structured as a memoir, in the sense that it has a bit of a chronological organization, although there are on my blackboard I have a map of what it is, but I mean it's sort of written as a memoir, but it's a memoir that tries to teach you the field of behavioral economics, and mostly done by telling stories. And it's supposed to be funny. So my publisher has assured me that no one has ever written a funny, substantive memoir that has sold, say, in the 2 digits. And so I didn't actually sell them this book. I sold them a book with the title Snags. And it was supposed to be like a prequel to Nudge, kind of stuff we trip on. But I couldn't figure out how to write that book. And so I wrote this book because I could figure out how to write it, and they liked something better than nothing. But they kept saying, the head of Norton keeps saying, it's a high wire act, it's a high wire act. And so anyway, that's all the weird ways in which misbehaving applies to this book.
Well, that's great. one of the things that I admire you for or envy you before is the fact that you get to hang out with people like Kahneman and Amos and people like that. And the thing that really strikes me about him is one comment he made in an interview one time where he said, "I've been studying this stuff for decades, and I still make the same mistakes."
Yeah. I mean, in Thinking Fast and Slow, he tells the story, and I got to watch this firsthand because as I talk about it in the book, I really started taking this seriously when I had a chance as a new assistant professor to go spend a year at Stanford hanging out with Kahneman and Tversky, who were then based in Israel and were visiting Stanford for a year. And the three of us got to spend a year thinking about this stuff. I didn't know anything about psychology. They didn't know anything about economics. So we were sort of tutoring each other. And I also got to watch them work. They were in the process of finishing the paper Prospect Theory that eventually won Kahneman the Nobel Prize, and Tversky would have shared it had he still been alive. And as Danny says in the book, they usually started with a problem that worked on them, a mistake they found themselves making. And then they would assume that applied to everybody and try and figure out what was going on. And then they would test it just to confirm that they weren't weirdos. But they have pretty good intuitions. And, so one of the things I learned from them is just to pay attention to what's going on in the world. And then the other thing I learned from them is, and there was one idea that I got from them from their early work about judgment that really made the whole field of behavioral economics possible, and it was the idea of predictable bias. And so take their idea of the availability heuristic, which is the idea that we judge frequency by ease of recall. So if I ask you, what's the ratio of gun homicides to gun suicides in the US, most people think that gun homicides will be a lot bigger. It turns out there's about twice as many gun suicides. Why do we make that mistake? Well, we read lots about gun homicides, not about gun suicides. So, and notice crucially that error is systematic. If I had done a poll, the average guess of the ratio of homicide to suicides would have been 3, and the correct answer was 0.5. So economists for a long time said, yeah, we know people make mistakes, but they cancel out, so life goes on. We know how to add an error term. And adding an error term doesn't work if the error terms are all in the same direction. And so, in a sense, I've spent a life studying predictable errors.
One of the things that I think about when I think about this whole how do you get over or how do you deal with these biases is how nudges relate to that. Because in some sense, is a checklist a nudge?
Yeah, absolutely. We all of us who are moderately functioning in society have learned about the ways in which we need help in coping. So most of us have alarm clocks if we want to wake up on time. We make lists because we forget things. The older you get, the more lists you need. And a checklist, Atul Gawande's fantastic book, The Checklist Manifesto, it's a spectacular book with the simplest possible idea, which is that there are all kinds, he, as a doctor, he focuses on applications to medicine, but it's an idea that they took from pilots. And, your typical commercial pilot has taken off and landed thousands of times. You wouldn't think he would need a checklist. But it's precisely because he's done it 1,000 times that he does need a checklist, because you can't afford to take off one time without filling up the tank. So, yeah, checklists. I have a checklist before I take a trip. Because I've forgotten my passport, it's bad to forget your passport. So, yeah.
So you were with Nathan last night. You're going to see him tonight at your talk downtown Seattle. And one of Nathan's famous speeches was called Roadkill on the Information Highway, and he made a lot of references to a man with a hammer syndrome. So let's take that sort of heuristic. How can you guard or lessen the chances that you're going to fall for something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that there are a lot of guys with hammers out there looking for nails or looking for anything that resembles a nail. And, we were talking before, this is the end of a 2-week book tour. And it started in New York I'm doing them all as conversations, just because it's more interesting for me. And it started with a conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, who insisted on psychoanalyzing me. We were on the Upper East Side, and now I've forgotten where was I going to go with this? You can see my brain is completely fried.
Man with a hammer.
Yeah. So, economists have a hammer, and they want to use it all the time. And there are some places where it works, and there are some places where it doesn't. And in some ways, I guess Malcolm's question to me was, why did I go into economics? And, because I admit to being not the best economist in the world. And I think what he was getting at was, in part, I ended up doing this because I wasn't a great economist. And I had to think of something to do, So, I wasn't as good with a hammer as most of my fellow economists. So I looked for places where you needed something other than a hammer.
So this building here has some of the best and most thoughtful people working on machine learning in the world. So the intersection of machine learning and what you do you have any general thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's Sendel Mulanathan. One of, I often say that over 40 years I haven't changed anybody's mind about anything. That there's this old Max Planck line that science marches on funeral by funeral. So, the guys my age that think I'm full of shit still think I'm full of shit, but they're gonna die. And the ones older than me, some of them already have. So my strategy all along has been to corrupt the youth. And Sendel was, it's Mullainthon, but your search engine will find it. It was a student of mine at Cornell. He was an undergraduate. And he was doing economics, computer science, and math majors in 3 years. And I noticed he was a bright kid. And so I tried to corrupt him. And it turns out right now he's trying to do machine learning and behavioral economics. And so look at some of the stuff he's doing. I would botch it if I tried to explain it, but there is that intersection, and he's it.
So the other thing people do here is obviously you write software. So can you think of, or have you experienced situations where people writing a web service of some kind have been able to use a nudge to achieve an objective? Now, the famous one, of course, is automatic opt-in on the 401k.
Yeah. You know, well, one of my favorite nudges actually comes from Google, where I was yesterday. And I don't use Gmail, but I'm almost tempted to do it precisely because of this, which is, we mentioned this in Nudge, and I think it caused them to actually incorporate in Gmail. How many people here have written an email saying, I've attached X, and then forgotten the attachment? So at my age, you do this about once a day. In Gmail now, if you use the word attachment and don't attach something, you'll get a message, did you forget the attachment? And okay. That's what Nathan tells me about everything. Anyway, that, you know, there are good and bad nudges. So automatic enrollment in pension plans is something that it's probably the most important influence behavioral economics has had on the world, is to change the way 401k plans are organized. So it used to be that the standard procedure was you get a pile of forms to fill out. If you don't fill them out, you're not in. We convinced companies to try switching the default to, if you don't fill out this pile of forms, you're in. That ups enrollments. In the first company that a colleague of mine, Bridget Madrian, studied, employees within the first year were signing up at 49%. It went to 86%. This is a standard thing that economists would say would have no effect. I call them, in the book, supposedly irrelevant factors. So the default is a supposedly irrelevant factor that matters a lot. The other thing we did was, along with one of my students, we invented something we call Save More Tomorrow. So you ask people whether they would want to agree to increase their 401k contribution later, because we all have more self-control in the future. You know, I'm planning a diet after the book tour, well after. And so lots of people who say, I can't afford to increase their saving rate now, can do it later. But, you know, whenever anybody asks me to sign a copy of Nudge, I always sign it Nudge for Good, because it's very easy to nudge for evil, or certainly nudge not for the good of the person that is responding. So one of the first reviews of this book appeared in a publication based in London. That's all I'll say about it. And it had a paywall. It has the most evil paywall I've seen yet. And this was the first review, so you can imagine I was anxious.
Financial Times.
Wrong. But don't keep trying that. So, I go, my editor sends me a link to this, and I see the first paragraph, and, get to the damn paywall. So, all right, there's a place. You can sign up for a 1-month subscription for £1. Now, I wrote the book, so I'm going to read the fine print on this. And you can quit after if you don't quit, you're automatically enrolled at 27 quid a month, which, is about $1,000 at current exchange rates. And to quit, you have to give them 15 days notice. 15 days notice. And I don't even want to think about what hoops you have. You probably have to call between 1 and 2 p.m. and hope there's somebody there to answer the phone. So there was no way I was going past that paywall. I got somebody else. My editor said he would do it, and he's poor, and he'll remember. He'll remember to unsubscribe an hour later. So I think business firms, like, if you guys invented the attachment reminder, God bless you, and we can all think of ways of making products easier to use. David Cameron's government in the UK read nudge and created a tiny unit of government called the Behavioral Insights Team. It started out as 5 people with me as an unpaid advisor. It's now grown to 50. And when I first started working with them, we'd go and have a meeting with some minister, and I found myself repeating the same phrase so often, it became known as the team mantra. And the phrase is, make it easy. If you want to get somebody to do something, make it easy. And now that sounds blatantly obvious, but most truth, once you hear it, is blatantly obvious. And so many of automatic enrollment, right? That's a great example of making it easy. And so many times we see people failing to do something that's in their best interest, and we can solve the problem by making it easy. And one of the ways we can do that now is through technology. And I think, let's just take one domain, health. We're spending $1 out of $6 in this country on healthcare. And there are lots of reasons for that, but and a lot of it has to do with the healthcare delivery system, but a lot of it has to do with we as a society don't take care of ourselves as well as we could. And most of us would like to be healthier. And, things like Fitbit are, technology. It's not even 1.0. I mean, that's such a primitive technology, but it's clear that that's the tip of a very big iceberg. And I think the people who harness that technology in ways that I can't possibly imagine, any more than I could imagine having a computer in my pocket 15 years ago, I think will change the world and make the world a healthier place. And so you guys can all play a role in that.
So let's change the subject a little bit. Let's talk about the academy and cross-disciplinary work. So one of the things that's so beautiful about your work is the fact that you've dabbled in multiple domains, and you're probably wandering around the campus, dealing with different departments. And that's probably, it's not encouraged in places like the faculty club, I know that. Mm-hmm. So what's the importance of multidisciplinary thinking and research, and how has that benefited you?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, so I haven't done as much of that as it might seem, and I've found it to be extraordinarily difficult. And one of the things I talk about in the book is something that the way the field has emerged was a complete surprise to Amos, Danny, and me 40 years ago. And the surprising thing is that it's a field done almost exclusively by economists. There are a half a dozen psychologists that have made contributions. They're all friends of mine. I mean, it's just a tiny group, and it didn't start out that way. So one of the first meetings we organized was a little meeting in New York where we had 6 of the greatest psychologists on earth in, think about the dream team of psychology. We had them in one room. And Amos and Danny were 2 of them, but Leon Festinger, who invented cognitive dissonance, and other people that you probably wouldn't know but were household names at the time. And we thought, because Amos, Danny, and I were working together, that that's the way the field would be. And it hasn't been true. And I think one of the reasons is that the entry barriers to economics are so high that it's very hard for psychologists to enter. I mean, you can do collaborations, but even that, psychologists don't get rewarded for co-authoring papers with economists that get published in economics journals. And economists don't get rewarded for publishing papers in psychology journals. And so pretty much the fields are separate. And it may be that in places like this, there's more room for true interdisciplinary research than there is in the academy, because the academy doesn't really reward it and doesn't facilitate it. And, it's hard at a large research university to know people outside of your own department. I had a colleague in the law school that I wrote a book with. I'm in the business school. I know people in the economics department. That's highly interdisciplinary of me. I know a few people in the psych department, and that's about it. So there are a couple thousand faculty members, and I may know 10 that aren't right in my inner circle. And I'm an interdisciplinary guy. And I mean, it's a problem, and there's no easy solution. And again, it may be that places like this, places like the old Bell Labs, are where it can happen better than at a university, because the output is something real rather than a journal article. And the professional goals are something other than getting tenure in a particular department.
Well, we have a situation in the field where people bring certain biases, political biases, as well as disciplinary biases. So we had a funny conversation before we started. He said, well, people think that I'm a communist, so I should sit in the left seat. And, I think...
No, I should sit in the seat that you will see as the right.
Okay, there we go.
Counter that bias. You see, Trent, you got to think about this.
I got it wrong. But it's sort of like this nudge thing with 401ks, which is, if you don't do anything, you're just nudging the other direction. So to me, there's no political judgment in making that.
I mean, you probably know this completely drives me crazy. That how many times I've heard that Cass and I are meddlers. And, in our book Nudge, it must take us until page 4 to address this question. And we start with a description of a cafeteria. And we say, suppose that the head of Seattle School Districts has done research that shows that the order in which the food is displayed influences what the kids eat. What should she do with that information? And, we suggest maybe putting the healthier food in more salient locations. And the cafeteria in the Booth School of Business where I work, you have to walk by the salad bar to get to the burgers. And that's good. it's now people who think we're meddlers. I say, well, how would you do it? You know, should we have the salad bar all in one place, or should we scatter it around the cafeteria so the lettuce is there, the tomatoes there, olive oil here, vinegar there, right? This is a catastrophe. So there's no, we describe the tools we use to nudge as choice architecture. And like architecture, there's no neutral choice architecture any more than there's neutral architecture. Any building has features because it has to have doors and windows and stairwells and elevators and bathrooms. All of those things influence where people go. There's a colleague of mine at Booth, when she chose her office, she chose one near the bathrooms, not because she goes to the bathroom a lot, but because she's social and she knew that everybody would be walking by her office a couple times a day. And right, so that you can't have neutral choice architecture. And so if you're going to have a pension plan, you got to decide what is the default. What's going to happen if people do nothing? The same is true for, you must have an open enrollment period for benefits in November. Somebody has to decide what happens if you don't go on to the website. And I'll tell you a funny story. It used to be at Chicago, we have a supplemental retirement plan. And the default setting was that if you do nothing, it goes back to zero. Almost all the defaults are one of two types, same as last year or back to zero. And fortunately, we don't have healthcare back to zero, or a third of the faculty would have no healthcare. But the supplemental retirement was back to zero. So I had set up a meeting with the president, the provost, and the CFO to talk to them about this. And by pure coincidence and luck, it happened to be the last day you could go onto this website and open enroll. And I mentioned that. Isn't it funny we're having this discussion this day? And right, the president says, "Oh, really? It's today?" You know? And then the provost says, my wife is going to do it. And then the CFO says, "I'm doing it right as soon as I leave the room." Now, I had them eating out of my hands. And we switched the default for the supplemental retirement to same as last year. And I think I have many colleagues who have, probably $100,000 more in retirement saving than they would have had had we not had that meeting on that particular day.
So I'm going to ask one more question here, and then we're going to have questions from the audience in here. So if you want to get ready to do your question, I'll ask one more here, and then maybe you can go to the microphone here. But I want to ask this question, again, changing the subject, about writing a book and the process of writing a book. Now, you got such smart people in this audience, and they've probably written lots of papers. But if you take someone out here who's maybe always thought about writing a book, what can you say about the process and its rewards, and can you nudge them in the right direction about whether they should or they shouldn't?
Don't do it. All right, let me give you some useful advice, which is, if you're as disorganized as I am, the most important thing I did in finishing this book was there was a student of mine who was finishing up her MBA and was super smart. We were trying to recruit her into the PhD program, She said no, she wants to be a consultant. And but she was my teaching assistant and whipped me into shape on my classes. And I asked her if she would help me finish the book, and she was basically my project manager. And in the acknowledgments, you'll see that I say that I don't think I could have ever finished this book without her. And then I have in parentheses, neither does she. So get some help. And I mean, I also hired a guy. There are beautiful figures in this book. I hired a guy who works for the New York Times, who draws those fantastic data visualizations that they use. And so, yeah, get help. Yeah. So let's open it up to the crowd. Don't be shy.
Any questions? Let me fill here while someone's maybe walking up. So,
No, walk up.
What? You ready?
Otherwise, he'll filibuster.
So is there an underlying reason why humans need to be nudged? Is there something built into us that's lazy?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting you use that word. The book starts with the following story, that I'm sitting in the living room of my good friend Daniel Kahneman, and he says, oh, damn, I forgot. I have an appointment with a reporter today who's writing a story about you, and he wants to talk to me. And, what should we do? So I thought about going to another room or taking a walk. He said, no, stick around. It could be amusing. Just keep quiet. So I said, okay, fine. So he's there talking, and, I pick up a magazine to read or something. And then I hear him saying to the reporter, the best thing about Thaler, what really makes him special, is that he's lazy. So, I'm going like this, and, I'd say, Danny, okay, I'm lazy. I admit I'm lazy. But is it my best feature? Can't you think of anything else And so he claims, he defends this to this day. I saw him last week, and this story came up, and he insists that this is true. And so his argument is that because I'm lazy, I only work on things that are sufficiently interesting to overcome my natural tendency to sloth. And whether that's a compliment or not, I don't know. But, look, all the things we need nudges for are because of the way we're hardwired. I mean, I'm not really into evolutionary psychology because I'm not sure, unless we get maybe Nathan will invent a time machine. But otherwise, I don't know how to test anything. But there are certain things that are obviously true, which is for almost all the time we've been on Earth, a good rule of thumb is eat everything you can, any chance you get. And, that served us well until about 100 years ago. And it got really bad about 50 years ago. So, so we need nudges because it didn't used to be that you could walk out your door and be confronted with lots of cheap, fattening food. You had to hunt and gather for it. And, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and figuring out what you're good at and what you're bad at is, like I said before, became a behavioral economist because, well, you think I'm just being self-deprecating. My thesis advisor in that same article that was written by, the author was Roger Lowenstein, the guy who wrote the book When Genius Failed, great, about the fall of LTCM. He was writing the article that Danny Kahneman was talking about. He also talked to my thesis advisor, who said of Thaler, well, as a graduate student, we didn't expect much of him. It's always good to have your advisor, supporting you. And so, yeah, you got to find something you're good at, and then cover your weaknesses. Yeah.
I'm super happy to hear you talk, and I myself I have discovered or learned about behavioral economics in the last couple of years and about thinking fast and slow, and I just learned that it's something relatively. I mean, you have been working for the last 40 years in this. Like now, looking at like the state of the field, what are the areas that you feel excited about, or the questions that you would like to keep working on, and you say like, oh, like this is something really that excites me and moves me?
Well, at the end of the book, I say that my hope is that the field turns to macro. So I mentioned we were surprised that the field didn't turn out to be interdisciplinary. Another big surprise was, of all the sub-disciplines of economics, the domain in which behavioral economics has had its biggest success is the one that seemed least likely 30 years ago, and that's finance. And it seemed least likely because economists knew that markets are efficient. Michael Jensen, who has several cameo appearances in this book, wrote a sentence saying the efficient market hypothesis is the best established fact in social science. And so obviously we weren't going to find any misbehaving there. But we did, and it's worthwhile asking why. The reason was, A, amazingly good data, right? Daily stock price data going back to 1926, and then zillions of countries, right? So amazing data. And second, very precise testable predictions. Like, you cannot predict the future. Okay? Well, great data and precise predictions that happen to be false is a recipe for success. Macro, unfortunately, has a paucity of data. And I say that because, there's zillions of numbers, but there are there are a countable number of recessions and maybe 2 financial crises in the U.S. And basically no well-specified testable hypotheses. So there are even colleagues of mine who don't think the Great Depression is a counterexample of the basic principles of economics, where this was a decade of 20% plus unemployment. Prices are supposed to adjust, right? So if that's not an embarrassment, what is? So I think it's harder because it's harder to prove, we've had to have in-your-face counterexamples. And it's harder to do that in macro. But I think the field now is sufficiently established that there are people who will be able to do behavioral macro. And I hope they do. Another very exciting field is behavioral public policy. And if you want a great introduction into where the field is headed, Trent mentioned I'm president of the American Economics Association, which meant I organized our annual meeting last year. You get to pick one person to give a big named lecture, and I picked a 35-year-old kid, part of my Corrupt the Youth movement, named Raj Chetty, Chetty. You can watch his lecture on the AEA website or read his paper that's just recently been published. And that's a great place to see where the field is going. And give me 10 more Raj Chettys and we'll be off and running. Yeah.
I think you've been covering what I was going to ask about already just in your most recent remarks, but I've got some friends that have virtually no economics background, but have paid attention to the behavioral economics literature, and especially to things like our persistent cognitive biases and the ways in which, as an individual, you want to hold on to something for, you know, a price that's rather higher than the market
Right.
would give you,
Yep.
and you want to buy for much less. How is it that the actual the aggregate effect of the efficient market hypothesis arises out of our individual wants to, you know, meet the, you know, keep on to what we have, sell for more than it's
Right.
worth? I'm curious. My friends will say that they don't really believe in this, but economics has still had an incredible predictive power, and people do behave like you see in the scissors of the supply and demand graphs.
So
Where does that come from?
Yeah, so part of that comes from, it turns out economists are easy graders when it comes to grading themselves. So one of my former colleagues, or soon-to-be former colleagues, John Cochran, has written an absurd blog post. If you think I'm making up the views of some of my critics, just go look at that blog post. Trend can point you to it if you have trouble finding it. But you can, he has in there the following sentence, that it's still the case that if the price of tomatoes goes up, people buy less tomatoes. Now, in 1961, Gary Becker, my colleague who just died last year, one of the great economists of the 20th century, and in a sense, somebody just doing the opposite of me, but he wrote a paper. I think he came to regret it because I cited it so often. He wrote a paper showing that if people choose at random but have limited resources, then demand curves slope down. So the fact that people buy less tomatoes when the price goes up would follow if we were choosing at random. So there are, when I have a PhD course in behavioral economics that I teach with a couple of my colleagues, and I started every year with an assignment for day one, which is to bring in the best empirical evidence supporting the hypothesis that people optimize. I've yet to have a satisfactory test of that shown to me, because there aren't any. So, demand curve slope down, fine. But we don't need people optimizing for that to be true. Now, when it comes to the efficient market hypothesis, I like to describe the two components of it that I call the no free lunch component and the price is right component. And the no free lunch component is that you can't beat the market. And that, I say, is approximately true. I mean, look, I'm a principal in an active money management firm called Fuller and Taylor. So we think we can beat the market. And we've been around for more than 20 years, so there's some evidence to suggest we can, but not by a huge amount. You know, maybe 3 or 4% a year, not every year. We've had some terrible years. You know, I think that's where we are. It's not impossible, but really hard. And if you assume it's impossible and put all of your money in index funds, it's not a bad strategy at all. Now, as far as the Price is Right component, fail. And I mean, just look at what we've seen in the last 30 years. 1987, the market crashes worldwide 20% on a day with no news whatsoever, other than the fact that prices are crashing. Then we had the tech bubble, where the NASDAQ went to 5,000 and fell to 1,500. And it surely wasn't because the internet turned out to be a disappointment, right? In fact, the internet has been shockingly wild. You know, I mentioned before, who would have thought we'd all have powerful computers in our pockets? We never would have dreamed that in 2000. So it's not been a disappointment, but the price seemed to be off by a factor of 3. That's pretty big. And, you know, then we've had the real estate crisis that led to the real estate bubble that led to a gigantic worldwide financial crisis. So prices can be very wrong. And it can be hard to test that. I'll give you one amusing recent illustration of how to test the Price is Right component. There's a closed-end mutual fund. Let me explain in one sentence what a closed-end mutual fund is. Most mutual funds, you send them money and they invest it and you buy what they own at the value of those securities, what's called net asset value. And then when you want your money back, they sell those securities and give you back your money. In a closed-end fund, they raise a certain amount of money, and then the shares of the fund trade, and they can trade for a price above or below net asset value, which in and of itself is an embarrassment to the efficient market hypothesis. One first pointed out by Benjamin Graham in the 1930s. Now, there's a closed-end mutual fund that happens to have the ticker symbol CUBA. Okay? Needless to say, it does not invest in Cuba. Right? A, that's against the law. B, there's nothing to invest in. Right? Maybe some cigar factories. But so for years, this is trading at a 15% discount. The day President Obama makes his announcement, it goes to a 70% premium. So, you know, on Monday, you could buy $100 worth of assets for $85. On Tuesday, $170. Is that an efficient market? I don't think so.
Hi. So you keep talking about like how you're trying to corrupt the youth, and I guess I would consider myself a corrupted youth, although I have to say I've never read any of your books, but but there's
competition for in the corrupting the youth.
That's true, but
business.
like, so I'm a recent graduate in economics, and like I didn't study it because I was good at it or because I even really liked it. I just needed to pick something. And like I don't know, while I was studying it, I was sort of like, you know, I worked really hard in like the intro classes and I like got the grades and stuff, but I was sort of like, I don't know, a lot of me was like, I should have done psychology. Like, that's really what I wanted to do. And I didn't really know that there was so much, like, there were these people that were sort of doing both at once. But I was like, so I've gone this far in econ, I should probably just finish. And while I was studying, like, I read a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which, like, was by far the most influential book I've ever read. And, like, basically, I mean, one of the main points of that book is that we think that we sort of, like, reason our way to the truth, but really, like, most of our judgments are intuitive, and, like, then we make up reasons to support the intuition. And I thought, like, I was basically convinced that if that's true, like, then, like, economics is, like, economics is about, like, we do optimization problems in our head and then, like, arrive at something.
Right.
I was like, I think Jonathan Haidt is right, and if he's right, then, like, none of what I'm learning in my classes makes sense. Like, but I can't just, like, if I change majors, I'll be in college for even more extra time, and I don't want to, like, drop out. And I was just like, so anyway, I just finished. Like,
Okay.
I don't work here.
So what's your question?
My question is, like, well, one, do you sort of think that economics has to sort of admit that humans are just animals? And, like, we think we're smart because the only tool we have to analyze our intelligence is our intelligence, which is, like,
All right.
I don't know. And also,
right.
what advice would you have for me?
My advice is, I will buy you a copy of my book.
I already bought one.
All right. Read it.
Okay.
Next question.
So it's probably a little bit of a plug to your next book, to an upcoming.
No.
No. It's just a question that interests me.
Okay.
You
It'll
haven't
be your
been,
book.
No. Yours. You have been observing the field for a long, long time, and Charlie Munger came up with his own list of biases.
Yeah.
Who's watching who here?
I mean, Charlie Munger has been an observer of this field for a long time. I met him probably 25 years ago. He once wrote something congratulating the University of Chicago for being willing to hire a renegade like me. I think we think along similar lines. He and Buffett are smart enough to have intuited a lot of these things. And a lot of behavioral economics is just common sense. And when you're as smart as they are and you have a lot of common sense, then you can kind of intuit much of what we've done. So we're fellow travelers. I think they should give me 10% of their wealth. So far, they haven't, but I can always hope.
Let's have one more question, and then we'll give time to sign books.
I took your managerial decision-making class at Chicago, and you did use a lot of sports to teach the concepts.
Yeah.
And one of the things I remember clearly was in the NFL going for two-point conversion. How's that thinking going to change with them talking about extending the length of the extra point?
So actually, no, I don't think we talked about the two-point conversion. There is a chapter about football in this book. It's about the NFL draft. We don't have time to go into it. I will say that I probably what you're remembering is I talked about going for it on fourth down. And there's a paper written by David Romer, an economist at Berkeley. It was published nearly 20 years ago, showing that teams don't go for it on fourth down nearly enough. A good rule of thumb is if it's 4th and 1, go for it. And anywhere on the field. And if it's 4th and goal on the 1, going for it gives you an expected 1.5 points more than kicking a field goal.
What about passing in that situation? Asking for a friend.
I think it's. Now I will say, in the coach's defense, there are mixed strategy equilibria, but that was not that situation. So the point I was going to make is, and I think there's, I've worked with 3 different NFL teams over the last decade or so, and here's kind of a sad fact, and I suspect it's true in domains other than sports. So Romer writes this paper. The paper has been replicated and extended and refined, and no one in the sports analytics community questions his results. And I think he understates the case because he leaves out the fact that if you know you're going to go for it on 4th down, you have more options on 3rd down. But here's the fact. If you plot frequency of going for it on 4th and 1 over the last 20 years, it's a flat line. Nothing. And the same is true for our NFL draft paper, where we say teams should be trading down. And the Redskins gave away like a lifetime supply of first-round draft picks to get RG3, where they could have had that other guy who made a bad pass in the Super Bowl, but has gone to 2 Super Bowls, which is 2 more than RG3. So, and one of the reasons why the Seahawks have been so good the last 3 years is they have a cheap quarterback. And the Patriots had the same thing the first few years of the Brady era, because he was the 199th pick. And when you have a quarterback that you're paying $1 million a year, and other teams are paying, Joe Flacco $20 million a year, that gives you $19 million a year to build the best defense in the league. So the bad news is you guys are going to have to re-sign Russell Wilson, and that means your defense isn't going to be as good. But there is some sports in the book. There's also some game shows, but I think we probably need to let you guys go back and push some frontiers.
And buy some books.
And buy some books. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.